Every history book tells you the same story. Darius III was the weak king who ran from Alexander the Great. The coward who abandoned his army, abandoned his family, and handed his empire to a Macedonian boy. That is the story the winners wrote. But history is never that simple. Because when you strip away the Greek propaganda and actually look at what Darius III faced, what he inherited, what he attempted, how close he actually came, a completely different picture emerges. This is the story of a king who fought one of the greatest conquerors in human history not once, not twice, but 3 times. A king who was betrayed by his own commanders, undermined by his own empire, and still refused to stop fighting. This is not Alexander's story today. This is the Persian side. And by the end of this video, you will never see Darius III the same way again. Let's begin. Before we talk about the battles, we need to talk about the man. Because almost everything you think you know about Darius III is wrong. The Persian king who faced Alexander was not a pampered royal who inherited a comfortable throne. He was not a man born into luxury who never tasted real danger. Darius III, born Artashata, was a provincial governor before he ever wore a crown. He spent years managing one of the most difficult regions of the Persian Empire. He understood war. He understood politics. He understood how quickly power could be taken away. Before becoming king, Darius did something almost no Persian monarch ever did. He fought in single combat against an enemy champion during a campaign in the Caucasus. And he won. He killed the man with his own hands. This was not a soft administrator sitting behind palace walls. This was a warrior who knew exactly what blood looked like up close. But here is where his story becomes genuinely tragic. When Darius III finally became king of Persia in 336 BC, he inherited an empire that was already crumbling from the inside. The previous 2 kings had both been assassinated. There were rebellions across Egypt and the eastern provinces. The Persian treasury, while still enormous, had been drained by years of internal conflict. The satraps, the regional governors who controlled vast territories, had grown dangerously independent. Many of them were running their own little kingdoms within the kingdom, ignoring orders from the capital and pursuing their own interests. Darius had approximately 2 years to stabilize this collapsing structure before Alexander crossed the Hellespont and invaded Persian territory. 2 years to reform a bureaucracy built over 2 centuries. 2 years to regain loyalty from commanders who had forgotten what loyalty meant. 2 years to prepare the largest empire on earth to face the most dangerous military force ever assembled. Most kings would have crumbled under that pressure before the first battle even began. Darius did not crumble. He adapted. He reorganized. He fought. What the Greek historians who wrote about this period never tell you is how much resistance Darius faced from within his own court. There were factions who wanted him replaced. There were generals who thought they knew better. There were advisors whispering in corners, making deals, protecting their own positions. Darius was not just fighting Alexander. He was simultaneously fighting the political decay of his own empire while trying to hold it together with sheer willpower. And yet he lasted 6 years against Alexander the Great. 6 years against a man who had never lost a single battle. Think about that for a moment. Every other king Alexander faced fell quickly. The Greek city-states collapsed. The Phoenician cities surrendered one by one. The Egyptian pharaoh simply handed over the keys. But Darius kept coming back. He kept rebuilding. He kept fighting. That is not the behavior of a coward. That is the behavior of a man who refused to accept defeat even when the entire world was telling him it was over. So the next time someone calls Darius III weak, remember this. Weak men do not fight Alexander the Great 3 times. Weak men do not rebuild armies from nothing after devastating defeats. Weak men give up. And whatever else you can say about Darius III, he never gave up. 334 BC. Alexander has just crossed into Persian territory with around 40,000 men. The Persian satraps of Asia Minor receive the news, and immediately gather their forces at the Granicus River. And here is where the first great betrayal of Darius III begins. Because Darius is not at the Granicus. He is not even close. And that is not because he was ignoring the invasion. It is because he had actually sent a strategy, a very good strategy, that his own commanders completely ignored. Darius had ordered a scorched earth approach. Pull back, burn the crops, destroy the food supplies. Let Alexander's army march into empty land with no food, no resources, no way to sustain itself. Starve them out. Force them to retreat without a single Persian soldier dying. It was a patient strategy. It was a smart strategy. It was exactly the kind of thinking that could have stopped Alexander before the war even truly began. The satraps rejected it. These were proud men, regional governors who had built their reputations on strength and dominance. Retreating felt like weakness to them. Standing and fighting felt like honor. So they gathered their cavalry, lined up at the Granicus River, and decided they would destroy Alexander themselves without even waiting for Darius and the main Persian army. They did not consult Darius. They did not follow his orders. They simply acted on pride, and they were destroyed. Alexander's cavalry crossed the river under heavy fire, climbed the steep bank, and tore through the Persian formation with terrifying speed and precision. The satraps fought hard. Several of them personally attacked Alexander during the battle and nearly killed him. One Persian noble named Spithridates had Alexander's helmet split by his sword and was only stopped when another Macedonian officer intervened at the last second. Alexander nearly died at the very first battle of the campaign. But nearly is not enough. The Persian forces collapsed, and the satraps who had ignored Darius's orders paid for that arrogance with their lives. Now here is the question nobody asks. What would have happened if the satraps had followed Darius's plan? Alexander's army was operating thousands of miles from home. His supply lines were stretched thin. His soldiers were marching through unfamiliar territory. If the Persians had burned the crops, poisoned the wells, and refused to engage, Alexander might have been forced to turn back within months. The invasion could have ended before it truly began. Not because Persia was militarily superior, but because patience and strategy would have beaten aggression and speed. Instead, Persian pride handed Alexander his first major victory and opened the road to the entire western coast of Asia Minor. Darius lost Granicus not on the battlefield, but in the council chamber, when his own commanders decided they knew better than their king. It was the first betrayal. It would not be the last. And it set the pattern for everything that followed. A king with the right ideas, surrounded by men too proud or too selfish to execute them. 333 BC. Darius has had enough of watching his subordinates lose his empire piece by piece. This time he is coming himself. He has assembled a massive army. Ancient sources claim over 500,000 men, though modern historians estimate somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000. The exact number almost does not matter. What matters is that Darius has built the largest fighting force Persia has fielded since Xerxes invaded Greece 150 years earlier. And this time the king is leading it personally. What happened next is one of the most underappreciated strategic moments of the ancient world. And it almost worked. Alexander's army was moving south along the coast. Darius made a bold decision. Instead of waiting for Alexander to come to him, he swung his army around through the mountains of Anatolia and came out behind Alexander. He positioned himself at Issus, directly across Alexander's supply lines and communication routes back to Macedonia. Alexander woke up one morning to discover that the Persian king was behind him. Not in front, behind. His supply lines were cut. His retreat was blocked. He was effectively surrounded. Think about how terrifying that would have felt in Alexander's camp that morning. They had marched hundreds of miles from home. Their food and supplies came through those routes Darius now controlled. Every message to Macedonia, every replacement soldier, every shipment of equipment, all of it now ran through Persian-controlled territory. Darius had not just outmaneuvered Alexander tactically, he had threatened to strangle the entire Macedonian campaign strategically. Alexander had no choice. He had to turn around and fight. And he had to fight on ground that Darius had chosen, not ground that Alexander preferred. The battlefield at Issus was narrow, hemmed in by mountains on one side and the sea on the other. This was important because it neutralized one of Persia's greatest advantages, sheer numbers. On open ground, Darius could have used his superior numbers to simply surround and overwhelm the Macedonian formation. The narrow terrain at Issus prevented that. But here is what almost nobody mentions. That terrain was not Darius's choice. It was geography. And despite that disadvantage, the Persian army still nearly won. On the Persian left flank, the Greek mercenaries fighting for Darius were absolutely dominating the Macedonian infantry opposite them. These were professional soldiers, trained in the same Hellenic tradition as Alexander's men, and they were pushing the Macedonians back with real force. For a period in the middle of that battle, the Persian left was winning. If the entire Persian line had held as well as that left flank, the battle would have had a completely different outcome. But Alexander was not attacking across the whole line equally. He was looking for the weak point, the gap between the Persian center and the Greek mercenaries on the left. He found it. He drove his companion cavalry through that gap like a spear, turned inward, and began rolling up the Persian center from the side. When Darius suddenly found Alexander's cavalry crashing into his personal guard just meters from where he was standing, the center collapsed around him. His charioteer was killed by a javelin. His royal guard began to break. The mathematically rational decision at that moment, the decision that preserved any chance of continuing the war, was to leave the field. And that is what Darius did. Greek historians called it cowardice. They wrote that he fled in panic, abandoning his men, abandoning his family who were captured in his camp. But consider the alternative. If Darius had stayed and died at Issus, the war was over. There would have been no more Persian resistance, no more armies raised, no more chances. By leaving, Darius kept the resistance alive. He still had the eastern provinces. He still had Babylon. He still had the ability to raise another army. His escape was not cowardice. It was cold strategic calculation in the worst possible moment. His family paid the price for that decision. His mother, his wife, his daughters, all captured by Alexander. To his credit, Alexander treated them with genuine respect, housing them in royal conditions and addressing Darius's mother with full royal honors. But they were still prisoners. And Darius spent the next 2 years knowing that his family was in his enemy's hands while he rebuilt everything from nothing. That psychological weight alone would have broken most men. Darius kept building, because the war was not over. Not yet. While Alexander was marching through Phoenicia and Egypt, consolidating his conquests and building his legend, Darius was doing something that most history channels completely ignore. He was negotiating. He was thinking. He was playing a longer game than anyone gives him credit for. And the offers he made during this period were so generous, so strategically brilliant, that they nearly split Alexander's own command in two. The first offer came shortly after Issus. Darius sent ambassadors to Alexander with a proposal: peace, a massive ransom for his captured family, an alliance sealed by marriage, and the cession of all Persian territory west of the Euphrates River. Let that sink in for a moment. Darius was offering to hand over Egypt, the Levant, Asia Minor, effectively everything Alexander had already conquered plus formal Persian recognition of those conquests. All Alexander had to do was stop marching east and accept the deal. Alexander's most experienced general, Parmenion, was present when the offer was read. Parmenion, a man who had won battles before Alexander was born, a general with decades of military wisdom, turned to Alexander and said words that have echoed through history ever since. He said that if he were Alexander, he would accept. The offer was that good. It was logical. It was rational. It gave Alexander everything a reasonable conqueror could want. Alexander rejected it. His response to Parmenion was cold and absolute. He said that if he were Parmenion, he would also accept. But he was Alexander. And Alexander wanted everything. Not half an empire. Not a treaty. Everything. Darius was not finished. He sent a second offer, even more generous than the first. This time he offered everything west of the Euphrates, 10,000 talents of gold, an almost incomprehensible sum, and his daughter's hand in marriage, which would have made Alexander a legitimate heir to the Persian royal bloodline. He was essentially offering Alexander a path to becoming co-ruler of the Persian Empire through diplomacy rather than total conquest. Once again, Alexander refused. But here is what this sequence of events tells us about Darius that nobody discusses. He was not a man paralyzed by defeat. He was not sitting in his eastern palace weeping and waiting for the end. He was actively managing the situation. He was using diplomacy as a weapon, trying to find the rational off-ramp that would save his empire even if it cost him territory and pride. These were not desperate offers from a broken man. They were sophisticated strategic moves designed to exploit the one weakness Alexander actually had: the possibility that his generals and his men might choose stability over endless war. If Alexander had been any other conqueror, Darius's strategy would have worked. Almost any other king in history would have taken that second offer and called himself the greatest conqueror who ever lived. But Alexander was not rational in the conventional sense. He was driven by something beyond strategy, and that made him, for Darius, essentially impossible to stop through normal means. 2 years after Issus, Darius was ready again, and this time he had learned from every mistake. This time there would be no narrow coastal plain to neutralize his numbers, no mountain passes limiting his cavalry. He had personally scouted and selected the battlefield at Gaugamela in what is now northern Iraq, and he had spent months preparing it. His men had literally flattened the ground to ensure his scythe chariots could operate at maximum effectiveness. He had 200 of those chariots, war machines fitted with blades extending from the axles designed to tear through infantry formations like a bladed storm. His army was enormous and deliberately diverse. He had recruited war elephants from India. He had Scythian cavalry from the northern steppes, some of the finest horsemen on earth. He had Bactrian cavalry, Parthian cavalry, Armenian cavalry. He had his elite Persian infantry, reorganized and re-equipped after Issus. He had Greek mercenaries. He had rebuilt essentially from scratch and created what may have been the most diverse and formidable army the ancient world had ever assembled in one place. The numbers at Gaugamela are disputed, but even conservative estimates put the Persian force at over 200,000 men against Alexander's approximately 47,000. Darius also had a plan specifically designed to neutralize the Macedonian phalanx that had broken his center at Issus. He was going to use his cavalry superiority on both flanks simultaneously, fold the Macedonian wings inward, and then crush the phalanx from the sides while his center held firm. It was a sound plan. It was the right plan. And for a significant portion of the battle, it was working. On the Persian left, Mazias led a devastating cavalry assault that broke through the Macedonian right wing and actually reached Alexander's baggage camp. Persian and allied cavalry were looting the Macedonian supplies while the main battle raged. On the Persian right, the Scythian and Bactrian cavalry were pushing back Parmenian's forces so aggressively that Parmenion sent an emergency message to Alexander saying his left flank was about to collapse. The Persian plan was working on both sides simultaneously. But then came the gap. In the chaos of coordinating such an enormous force across such a wide battlefield, a gap opened in the Persian center left. It was not large. It was not intentional. It was the kind of small, momentary disorder that happens in every battle. But Alexander saw it instantly. He had been watching the entire battlefield while leading his companion cavalry, waiting for exactly this moment. He formed his cavalry into a wedge, pointed it at the gap, and charged with everything he had. What followed was one of the most decisive charges in military history. Alexander's cavalry tore through the gap and turned directly toward Darius. Suddenly, the Persian king found himself once again with enemy cavalry crashing toward his personal position. Once again, the center around him began to collapse. Once again, the rational calculation led to the same terrible conclusion. And once again, Darius left the field. The last best chance to stop Alexander was gone. Darius III fled east after Gaugamela. He still had the eastern provinces. He still had men willing to fight. He was already planning a fourth resistance when his own satrap Bessus had him arrested and then murdered him when Alexander's cavalry was closing in. He was stabbed by the men who were supposed to protect him and left dying on the side of a road. Alexander found him still alive, barely. By the time Macedonian scouts reached him, he was gone. Alexander reportedly wept. He covered Darius's body with his own cloak and ordered him buried with full royal honors in Persepolis, in the tomb of the Persian kings. Even Alexander, the man who had destroyed everything Darius built, recognized that he had faced a genuine king. And that is the truth the history books bury under layers of Greek triumphalism. Darius III was not a coward. He was not weak. He was a man who inherited a rotting empire, faced the greatest military mind in history, came genuinely close to stopping him on at least 2 separate occasions, and never stopped fighting until his own people took him from behind. He deserved a better end. He deserved better generals. He deserved better luck. In a different world, with different commanders at Granicus, different terrain at Issus, a slightly larger gap in a different place at Gaugamela, we might be watching a video today called How Darius III Stopped the Macedonian Invasion.